And we invited a special guest to start off the 2022 International Conference on Women's Rights and Peace. She is a women's rights activist who was engaged in critical media activities in Russia after the outbreak of the Ukraine war in March 2022. Feeling the serious threats, she left Russia in March 2022 and she now resides in Israel, continuing to collect the voices of women suffering from the Ukraine war. And she delivers the truth to independent media. Nastya Krasilnikova joins us through video. She will deliver a special keynote speech on the topic of Ukraine war and violence against women. Ms. Nastya Krasilnikova, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I hope the sound is okay. As you already know, my name is Nastya Krasilnikova. And today I want to speak about the war in Ukraine that goes on right now and violence against women. And I want to thank you for inviting me today. And I think that the matters I'm going to talk about are important. They're important for me as a Russian feminist activist, and I think that they matter for many women from all over the world. And the point I'm going to prove you, I hope to prove you today, is that war affects women, and the neglect of women's rights on the state level can be one of the reasons of the war. I'm an independent journalist and a feminist activist from Russia. And the 24th of February, when Russian President Vladimir Putin declared special military operation against Ukraine, it became one of the most horrible days of my life. The war that Putin unleashed brought me fear for my loved ones who live in Ukraine, pain and fear for all the innocent people who are dying. The war that Mr. Putin, president of Russia, started on the 24th of February, it brought me a lot of fear for people I love that live in Ukraine and people I don't know that also live in Ukraine. It also brought me a lot of shame for being from Russia and not being able to change anything. Repressions against journalists and activists in Russia, in modern Russia, began several years ago. With time, they became more severe. During my career, I have been getting all kinds of threats from conservative part of Russian society. And when Putin's war started this February, it became obvious for me that it's becoming extremely dangerous to remain in Russia. So in the beginning of March, me and my family, my husband and my son, we left my homeland, and I'm not sure if I'm going to come back ever. I have a popular feminist blog on, in Russian. It's called Robber's Daughter. Before the war, it was a blog about everyday sexism and fighting for women's rights. And when the war started, my blog became a platform for Ukrainian women who told me their stories about their experiences during their war and about their resilience. I published around 100 monologues of women from all over Ukraine. Those women who had to flee the country and those women who preferred to stay at home. Those women who lost everything and those who found strength to start over. And those women who were saving children and elderly people, and those who suffered from Russian soldiers. And when it comes to war, we usually hear about men, about their fight and their losses and their heroism. But women, they suffer and they fight just as much as men. And I want to tell you more about the amazing and brave Ukrainian women, and I will show you how they are protecting their country and themselves. First of all, it's very important to say that Ukrainian women are a very important part of armed forces. No one will tell you the exact number of women in armed forces in Ukraine because it is classified information. But we know that until February 24th, there were 30,000 women participating in hostilities in Ukraine. But now there are more of them in the army. 15% of the Ukrainian military forces are women soldiers and women officers. And among those involved in the military sphere, including, for example, officials in the Ministry of Defense, the number of women is 25%. In 2018, Ukraine adopted a law on gender equality in the armed forces. Since then, there are 63 combat positions for women in the army. And after the Russian invasion on February 24, women's interest in the service increased markedly. We also know that this war made Ukrainian women subjected to sexual violence. And one of the main threats to Ukrainian women during this war is rape by Russian military. Human rights activists and psychologists began to record the first cases early March. Now, probably the number of victims of sexual violence grows to hundreds and maybe thousands. Not every woman can decide to speak up and seek help, so it is impossible to establish the exact number of victims. There are reports of girls and women being raped, including the elderly, about gang rapes and rapes in front of children, and about the rapes of boys and men. We know that sexualized violence during the war is a war crime, and it is prohibited by Article 27 of Geneva Convention. We know that Ukrainian women note that most brutal violence often preceded the retreat of Russian troops. I have talked to many people who are helping rape victims in Russia and Ukraine. And one of them is Natalia Timofeyeva. She works in the center that is called Sisters. Sisters is an organization that has been helping survivors of sexual violence since 1997. And Natalia says that rape accompanies every war. She emphasizes that rape is not related to sexual desire. And this is important to understand about. This is very important to understand about rape. It's not about desire. This is why many experts are calling for the term sexual violence to be replaced with the term sexualized violence, because actually there is nothing sexual about violence. And Natalia explains that a person who commits violence may experience sexual arousal, but his primary motive is to gain power and control over the life and body of another human being. And those rapes that Russian soldiers commit in Ukraine are a result of Russia's long-term policy of normalizing violence, which has become an important part of society and an important part of official rhetoric. We also know that rape is one of the weapons of war. And we know that by raping Ukrainian women and children, Russian soldiers want to instill fear in them. This is a terror of civil population, so that people are afraid and so they do not resist. Rape is a way of showing that if you behave well, you will not be killed. Rape is a violation of human rights and a terrible crime. There are quite specific criminal acts that the rape and everything that comes with it is a quite specific criminal act that have a perpetrator, and those specific individuals who can be named, who can be guilty of it. Any rape, no matter when it occurs, is always very difficult to prove as a crime and to achieve a fair trial in order to convict the rapist. This is always a difficult task to achieve, both in terms of how this crime is structured and in terms of the consequences that victims have to face. But in wartime, this difficult task becomes almost unachievable. Various studies show that rape survivors can recover and do something with their life, go on with their lives. But society has to understand that this trauma of being raped is also a social trauma, and society has to believe that those who survived rape didn't become worse and didn't become less valuable. We know that this discourse was very common during the Second World War. Women who suffered multiple rapes by the military side were labeled as collaborators. Their children were discriminated against in every possible way as children of aggressors. And now it is obvious that these people are not to blame in any way, but the only thing they need is support and nothing more. Rape itself is a hate crime, but during the war, the motive of hatred expands. Women, children, and men become representatives of a hated people. The rapist is trying to inflict maximum damage and maximum fear on a person as a representative of other people, of an enemy. War rapes are often committed in groups, and this is the way of solidarity, an attempt to relieve oneself of part of the responsibility, like, it's not my fault if everyone is doing it. And this is what we often see in rape cases on this war. And recently, I've read a phrase that impressed me deeply, and it said, you can kill a person by accident, but it is impossible to rape a person by accident. Ukrainian women are also forced to leave their homes, and they often become responsible for their families. We know that the vast majority of refugees from Ukraine are women and children. According to the United Nations, in any armed conflict, women and children make up to 80% of all refugees. Women run not only with children, but also with older relatives and pets, and they become responsible for everyone. Taking children to a safe place is one of the main motives for evacuation for Ukrainian women. Having reached a safe place, women still cannot feel safe because they need to worry about housing, about earning money, and educating children in a country they don't know anything about. And many European cities are, as we know, overflowing with the Ukrainian refugees. And some Ukrainians, unable to find a place for themselves there, have to come back to Ukraine, even to places where it is still unsafe. And no one, unfortunately, provides systematic support to refugees. And people are often left alone with their problems. Simultaneously with this, many Ukrainian women feel guilty for being saved while their husbands are fighting for their freedom. We also know that many Ukrainian women, when they flee to European countries, they face sometimes harassment and other gender-based violence from those people who are supposed to protect them and give them support. Lastly, I want to say that violence against women is part of Russia's policy. Russian authorities refuse to call this war a war. They insist on calling it a special military operation. Russian anti-war activists and ordinary people are being persecuted for calling this war a war, and it is officially prohibited in Russia. Why is it so important for Russian authorities to not call a war by its name? I think that this is a part of their strategy to gaslight as many people as possible. They are saying that they are giving freedom to Ukrainian people, but this freedom comes with bombs, deaths, rapes, and broken lives. This is how gaslighting works. Someone big and powerful is trying to convince you that you do not understand obvious things. Gaslighting is often a part of violence against women, and I think that violence became a political strategy of Russian authorities, and gaslighting is one of their methods. First, they were gaslighting their own people, Russian people, and now they're trying to gaslight the whole world. They're trying to convince the whole world that the deaths they bring to Ukraine are necessary for reaching a bigger goal. But they do not know that there are no goals that can justify even one death. And Ukrainian women and men are fighting for their and our freedom every day. And one more thing, 2 weeks ago, I published an investigation that I had been working on for 6 months. This is an investigative podcast about a famous school in Moscow where teachers had sex with teenagers and children, and no one stopped them for 2 decades, 20 years. These teachers are Russian intellectual elite. They're scientists, they're university employees, they're prosperous and successful men about whom it's very difficult to think that they can seduce underage people for years. But sexualized violence, unfortunately, flourishes in Russia at all levels. And despite the fact that Russian laws clearly state that a criminal is entitled to a prison for this kind of violence, it is almost impossible to get justice in such cases and to convict a perpetrator, especially when it comes to teenagers, because existing laws, they do not work. I think about how decades of abuse in a prestigious Moscow school are connected to Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. And I suppose that violence against teenagers can be turned a blind eye for decades, and the same support for this horrible war can become possible in Russia's society. Russian women are still not protected from domestic violence because the authorities do not accept that such problem exists, and Russian children, Russian teenagers are not protected from sexualized violence even when they come to schools to study. And I think that gender-based violence, which is so overlooked, begins this global long-term violence that we are witnessing now. Thank you.